His voice was a blade of ice in the dusty, frigid air of the warehouse. "Let her go, Choi." Kwon Ji-hoon stood in the cavernous doorway, a silhouette of bespoke tailoring against the dying city light. He was alone, but the emptiness around him felt more dangerous than an army. Choi, a man whose ambition had always outstripped his intelligence, laughed, the sound wet and ugly. He pressed the cold steel of a gun barrel harder against Hana's temple. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She squeezed her eyes shut, the rough rope biting into her wrists. This was it. This was the world she had run from, the darkness she had tried to deny, and it had found her anyway. "Going soft, Ji-hoon?" Choi sneered, his face a mask of triumphant cruelty. "I heard you were cleaning house, selling off the family jewels. For what? For her?" Ji-hoon took a single, deliberate step forward. The dust motes dancing in the single beam of light didn't dare to settle on the immaculate wool of his coat. His face was a study in lethal stillness, but Hana, who had spent weeks memorizing every line and shadow of it, could see the storm raging in his eyes. It was a storm she knew was meant only for him to weather, but she could feel the gale-force winds of it from across the room. It was the same storm she had seen the day he confessed everything, the day she had walked away. "This has nothing to do with her," Ji-hoon said, his tone dropping to a level of cold fury that made the air itself seem to thin. "This is between you and me." Choi's grin widened. "Oh, I think it has everything to do with her now." He cocked the hammer. The click was the loudest sound Hana had ever heard. In that split second, she didn't think of the pain or the fear. She thought of Ji-hoon's hand, surprisingly gentle, dabbing antiseptic on a scrape she'd gotten on her arm. She thought of the loneliness in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. She thought, "I love you." The thought was a useless, beautiful tragedy. And then Ji-hoon moved. 3 months earlier, the world had been a much simpler, if more exhausting place for Seo Hana. Her reality was the bitter scent of overbrewed coffee, the incessant chime of the convenience store door, and the constant, dull ache in her feet. Seoul was a city of glittering promise, but for her, it was a treadmill of debt and obligation. Her mother's medical bills were a mountain, and Hana was chipping away at it with the tiny pickaxe of a double-shift life. She poured her exhaustion into a lukewarm cup of instant noodles, the steam fogging her glasses as she sat in the cramped apartment she shared with her best friend, So-hee. "You look like a ghost that lost a fight with another ghost," So-hee commented, expertly plucking the last piece of kimchi from the jar between them. "I feel like one," Hana mumbled, pushing her food around. "The new manager at the cafe wants us to start up selling pastries, with synergy and passion. I barely have the energy to ask if they want milk." So he sighed, her expression softening. "Any word from the hospital?" Hana shook her head, the familiar weight settling in her chest. "The next payment is due on the 1st. I'm thinking of picking up a weekend delivery route." "Hana, you can't. You don't sleep as it is." "What other choice is there?" She looked around their tiny apartment, at the peeling paint and the mismatched furniture. It was home, but it was also a constant reminder of how far she was from any kind of stability. She hated this feeling of being trapped, of her life being dictated by a number on an invoice. Kwon Ji-hoon had never worried about an invoice in his life. His concerns were measured in billions of won and the subtle shifts of power within the city's underworld. He sat at the head of a polished obsidian table 20 floors above the sprawling metropolis, a king on a throne of glass and steel. The men lining the table were older, their faces etched with the harsh realities of the world he commanded, a world inherited from his father. They spoke of mergers, acquisitions, and hostile takeovers. Ji-hoon listened, his face an unreadable mask. He felt nothing, not excitement, not pride, only the crushing weight of a legacy he had never asked for. His father had built an empire, a chaebol with roots that sank deep into the legitimate soil of construction and technology, but with a darker, more extensive network that thrived in the shadows. Now, it was Ji-hoon's empire, his cage. The Sungjin Group is vulnerable, one of the directors was saying. We should move on their shipping division. Ji-hoon's gaze drifted to the window. Rain had begun to fall, smearing the city lights into a watercolor blur. He felt a suffocating need for air. Without a word, he stood up. The entire room fell silent, the half-spoken sentence dying on the director's lips. The meeting is over, Ji-hoon stated, his voice quiet but absolute. He walked out, leaving a room full of powerful men staring at his empty chair. His second-in-command, Park Min-jun, fell into step beside him as he strode towards the private elevator. Min-jun was the only person in the world Ji-hoon considered a friend, a man whose loyalty was as sharp and unwavering as his neatly pressed suits. "Is everything all right, sir?" Min-jun asked, his tone carefully neutral. "I need a walk," Ji-hoon said, not breaking his stride. The command was absurd. Kwon Ji-hoon did not simply take a walk. His movements were calculated, secured, and planned. But Min-jun merely nodded. "Of course, I'll have the car follow at a distance." Down on the street, the rain was coming down in earnest. The city smelled of wet pavement and exhaust fumes. Ji-hoon ignored the umbrella Min-jun tried to offer and walked, letting the cold drops plaster his dark hair to his forehead. He felt a strange sense of release in the discomfort. He crossed the wide boulevard, the headlights of passing cars sliding over his expensive coat. And then he saw her. Across the street, huddled beneath the flimsy, broken awning of a closed bookshop, was a woman. She wasn't dressed for the weather, her thin jacket soaked through, her hands shoved deep into her pockets. Her head was bowed against the wind, but as he watched, she lifted her chin. Her face, illuminated by the erratic glow of a flickering neon sign, was pale and tired. There were shadows under her eyes. But in her expression, there was a spark of something fierce, a stubborn, resilient defiance that seemed to push back against the entire storm. The world stopped. For Kwon Ji-hoon, the cacophony of Seoul, the traffic, the rain, the distant sirens faded into a dull, humming silence. There was only her, a stranger, a woman looking as though she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, yet refused to be crushed by it. He felt a pull, a strange, inexplicable resonance in the hollow chambers of his chest. It was a feeling so foreign he couldn't immediately name it. It was longing. He stood there, frozen on the pavement, oblivious to the rain and the curious glances of passers-by. He watched her shiver, watched her clench her jaw and stare out into the deluge as if daring it to do its worst. "Min-jun," he said, his voice rough. He didn't take his eyes off her. "Sir?" "Find out who she is." The strange things started a week later. Hana arrived at her apartment after a grueling 14-hour day to find an official-looking envelope slipped under the door. She opened it with trembling fingers, expecting another overdue notice. Instead, it was a receipt, her rent, paid in full for the next 3 months. "What is this?" she breathed, showing it to Sohee. "A mistake? A scam?" Sohee examined it, her brow furrowed. "This looks legitimate. Is it possible your mother—" Hana shook her head. "No, absolutely not." The next day, a team of delivery men arrived at the cafe, wrestling a gleaming state-of-the-art Italian espresso machine through the door. The manager was ecstatic. "A gift," he crowed, "from an anonymous benefactor to support local businesses." Hana stared at the chrome beast, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. Benefactors didn't exist in her world. There was always a price. "This is creepy," she muttered to Sohee over the phone that night. "First the rent, now this. It feels like someone is watching me." "Maybe you have a secret admirer," Sohee suggested, a teasing note in her voice. "A rich, handsome one who appreciates your passionate upselling." "It's not funny. It's invasive." From the tinted window of his car parked a block away, Ji-hoon watched her through a pair of high-powered binoculars as she locked up the cafe. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the suspicious way she scanned the street before starting her walk to the bus stop. He was making a mess of this. Min Jun sat in the driver's seat, the picture of silent professionalism. The reports show she is unsettled by the anonymous gifts, sir. As I predicted. Ji-hoon lowered the binoculars, his jaw tight. I am trying to help her. Your methods are direct, Min Jun offered, the closest he would ever come to criticism. A woman like her values her independence. You are, in essence, stealing it. Ji-hoon's internal world was a conflict zone. He knew Min Jun was right. He wanted to ease her burdens, to wipe that exhausted look from her face, but the only tools he possessed were money and power. He didn't know how to be gentle. He only knew how to acquire, to control, to own. He watched her board the crowded bus, a small, determined figure swallowed by the city, and the ache in his chest sharpened. He was fascinated by her authenticity, and yet he was trying to smother it with 100,000 bills. Hana was not a woman to let things lie. The final straw was a notice from the hospital. Her mother's entire outstanding balance, a staggering sum, had been cleared. An administrative error, the clerk on the phone had claimed, but Hana knew better. This was not kindness, it was a power play. Fueled by a cold rage, she started digging. The delivery company for the espresso machine was a subsidiary of a larger logistics firm, which was, in turn, owned by a massive conglomerate, the Yunsung Group. The name was plastered all over the city's most impressive skyscrapers. Armed with nothing but righteous fury, she took the subway to Gangnam and marched into the lobby of the Yunsung Tower. It was like stepping into another dimension. The air was cool and smelled faintly of jasmine and money. People in sharp suits moved with quiet, purposeful strides. She felt shabby and out of place in her worn jeans and faded jacket, but her anger was a suit of armor. I need to see Chairman Kwon, she announced to the receptionist, whose perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose in amusement. Do you have an appointment? No, but he'll want to see me. The call was made, a hushed conversation followed, and to Hana's shock, she was not thrown out. Instead, the elevator doors slid open and he stepped out. The man from the rain. He was even more intimidating up close. Taller than she'd realized, dressed in a suit so perfectly tailored it looked like a second skin. His face was all sharp angles and controlled intensity, but his eyes, dark and searching, were fixed on her. You, she breathed, the single word a mix of accusation and shock. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He dismissed the hovering security guards with a flick of his wrist. We can talk in my office. No, we can talk right here. Her voice trembled slightly, but she held his gaze. Who are you, and why are you stalking me? A flicker of something, surprise, admiration, crossed his features before being suppressed. My name is Kwon Ji-hoon, and I am not stalking you. I am ensuring your well-being. By paying my rent? By clearing my mother's debt? Is that legal? It feels incredibly illegal. The sarcasm was her only shield against the sheer force of his presence. The legality is not your concern. Everything you're doing is my concern. I don't want your money. I don't want your help. I want you to leave me alone. He took a step closer. She had to tilt her head back to look at him, and she hated the feeling of vulnerability it gave her. I can't do that, he said, his voice a low murmur that was somehow more commanding than a shout. Your life is difficult. I can make it easier. I don't want easy. I want my life, the one I built, the one I'm paying for. Then work for me, he said, changing tactics. It was a blunt, unexpected offer. I'll pay you a salary that will solve all your problems, an administrative position. The work will be simple. She stared at him, aghast. He thought he could just buy her. A smile, sharp and humorless, touched her lips. It was a smile like a punch to the chest. No thank you, Chairman Kwon. I'm not for sale. She turned and walked away, her back ramrod straight, every ounce of her willpower focused on not running. She could feel his eyes on her until the automatic glass doors slid shut behind her, cutting him off. The encounter left Hana deeply shaken. So he listened with wide eyes as Hana recounted the confrontation, pacing their small living room like a caged animal. "Ha, he offered you a job? Just like that?" So he asked, a mixture of awe and alarm in her voice. "Hana, this is like something out of a drama." "It's not a drama, it's a nightmare," Hana retorted, running a hand through her hair. "He's terrifying. The way he looks at you, it's like he's deciding where to put you in his collection." She shuddered. The intensity in his gaze had been overwhelming, a physical force she could still feel pressing on her. She tried to force her life back into its normal rhythm. She went to the cafe, she went to the convenience store, but the world felt different now, tilted on its axis. She kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see a sleek black car idling at the curb or to feel the weight of his stare. The city, once a backdrop to her struggle, now felt like his personal chessboard, and she was an insignificant pawn he was moving at will. Ji-hoon sat in his penthouse. The glittering city spread out below him like a carpet of fallen stars. Her refusal had been a shock to his system. No one said no to him. Ever. But instead of anger, he felt a grudging, infuriating respect. It solidified his obsession. He didn't just want to possess her. He wanted her to choose him. He wanted her to look at him, Kwon Ji-hoon, and see something more than a walking bank account. He knew his methods had been clumsy, an invasion. He needed a different approach, one that would make her see the necessity of his presence in her life. Late the next night, he drove himself, dismissing his driver and security detail. He parked down the street from the convenience store where she worked her second shift. He watched as the late-night customers trickled in and out, drunken office workers, tired students, lonely wanderers. He waited until the street was quiet, until it was just her, visible through the large glass window, methodically restocking shelves. He got out of the car and walked in. The bell above the door chimed, a ridiculously cheerful sound in the sterile quiet. Hana looked up, and her face went pale. All the color drained from her cheeks, leaving her eyes wide and dark. She straightened up, her hand gripping the edge of a shelf. "What are you doing here?" He ignored the question and walked calmly to the refrigerated section, his expensive leather shoes silent on the linoleum floor. He took out a single bottle of water. He placed it on the counter between them. "That will be 1001, she said, her voice tight and professional, refusing to meet his eyes. He placed a 50,001 note on the counter. "Keep the change." He didn't move. He watched her, the rigid set of her jaw, the slight tremor in her hand as she opened the register. "Your neighborhood isn't safe," he said, his voice low. She finally looked at him, her eyes flashing with anger. "I've lived here for 5 years. I'm fine." "There have been 3 assaults within a 4-block radius in the past 2 weeks, he stated, a cold, hard fact. He didn't mention that his own men, operating under his strict orders, had quietly discouraged several other potential threats in the area, a fact that would have horrified her. "It's late. Let me take you home." "No." The refusal was instant, automatic. "I'm not asking as a favor. I'm telling you as a fact. It is not safe for you to walk home alone." He could see the conflict in her face, her pride warring with a flicker of genuine fear. He pressed the advantage. "I can have a man watch over you. A bodyguard." She let out a short, sharp laugh that held no humor. "A bodyguard? Are you serious?" She shook her head, a look of utter disbelief on her face. "I don't need a bodyguard." He held her gaze for a long moment, the space between them crackling with unspoken tension. "Fine," he said finally. He picked up his water and turned to leave. At the door, he paused and looked back at her. "Be careful, Hana." The warning hung in the air long after he was gone. 3 hours later, her shift ended. The street was deserted, shrouded in a damp, late-night mist. The familiar walk home suddenly felt menacing. Every shadow seemed to lengthen. Every distant noise seemed to echo with threat. She clutched her bag to her chest, her footsteps quickening. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that his words had just gotten into her head. She was halfway down a poorly lit side street when two figures emerged from a dark alleyway ahead of her. They were rough-looking, their movements unsteady but purposeful as they blocked her path. "Nice bag," one of them slurred, his eyes glinting with malice. "Why don't you give it to us? And your phone, too." Hannah's blood ran cold. She froze, her mind racing. She could scream, but there was no one to hear. She could run, but they had her cornered. She took a step back, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Just as the second man reached for her, a pair of brilliant white headlights sliced through the darkness, pinning them in the beams. A long black sedan had appeared at the end of the street, its engine a low, predatory growl. It hadn't been there a second ago. The car door opened and a figure stepped out, Kwon Ji-hoon. He didn't run, didn't shout. He just stood there, his presence alone a palpable threat. The casual menace in his posture was more terrifying than any weapon. The two thugs exchanged a panicked glance, their drunken bravado evaporating in an instant. Without a word, they turned and fled back into the alley. Ji-hoon walked toward her, his face an unreadable mask of stone in the harsh glare of the headlights. He stopped in front of her, his shadow swallowing her whole. She was trembling, a reaction of fear and adrenaline, but also of a strange, unwilling relief. He looked down at her, his dark eyes sweeping over her, checking for injury. Then his gaze met hers, and his expression was grim, devoid of any triumph or, "I told you so." "Get in the car," he said. It wasn't a request. It was a command wrapped in the cold, undeniable fact of her terror. This time, she didn't argue. The silence inside the car was as luxurious and heavy as the leather seats. Hannah stared out the window, watching the gritty streets of her neighborhood slide by, replaced by the glittering, sterile avenues of Gangnam. She felt as if she were being transported across a border into a foreign country. He hadn't said a word since she'd gotten in, his focus entirely on the road, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. The sheer power of the man radiated in the enclosed space, a low hum of energy that was both frightening and, to her immense frustration, strangely calming. He drove not to her apartment, but to the soaring glass tower she had stormed into just days before. He led her through a private elevator that opened directly into his penthouse. The space was breathtaking and completely soulless. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic view of Seoul, a dazzling, impersonal jewel box. The furniture was minimalist, expensive, and looked as though it had never been used. It was the home of a man who didn't live anywhere. Hannah stood awkwardly in the center of the vast living room, feeling like a stray cat brought into a palace. She wrapped her arms around herself. "You're shaking," Ji-hoon observed, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a first aid kit. He gestured to a severe white sofa. "Sit." She obeyed, her defiance temporarily short-circuited by shock. He knelt in front of her, and she saw that in her attempt to pull away from the thugs, she had scraped her arm against a brick wall. It was a minor scratch, but he treated it with the intense focus of a surgeon. He gently cleaned the wound, his touch surprisingly careful. The contrast between the dangerous man who had materialized out of the darkness and the one now tending to her with such quiet concentration was a dizzying contradiction. She could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, a subtle fragrance of sandalwood and something else she couldn't name. Power, maybe. You will stay here," he said, not looking up from his task as he applied a bandage. Hannah's head snapped up. "What? No! You can't be serious. You'll take me home." He finally met her gaze, and the gentleness was gone, replaced by an unyielding authority. "That is no longer your home. It's not safe. You will stay here, where I can ensure your safety." It was an order, a declaration. He was drawing a line around her, claiming her as territory to be protected. Inside his own head, Ji-hoon was battling a cold, terrifying rage. Not at the thugs, but at himself. He had left her vulnerable. He had respected her wish for independence, and it had almost gotten her seriously hurt. The image of that man reaching for her was burned into his mind. Never again. A primal, possessive need to lock her away, to keep her wrapped in cotton wool where the world couldn't touch her, rose up in him. He knew it was wrong, knew it was controlling, but the fear of losing her, of something happening to her, was a far more powerful force than reason. The first few days were a war of wills. Hannah woke up in a guest suite larger than her entire apartment, with a closet full of clothes in her size that had appeared overnight. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage. She tried to leave, but the elevator required a key card, and the polite but immovable guards in the hallway made it clear there was no other way out. She confronted him every evening when he returned from work. "This is kidnapping," she yelled at him during one tense dinner they ate in silence at opposite ends of a long, polished table. He calmly sliced his steak. "This is protection." He gave her a black credit card with no name and no limit. "Buy whatever you want. Have it delivered." She threw it on the table. It skidded across the polished surface and came to a stop near his plate. "I am not a possession you can decorate and maintain," she seethed, her voice sharp as broken glass. A muscle feathered in his jaw. He was frustrated and enthralled. Her fire was the only thing that made him feel alive. In his world, people bowed. They agreed. They feared. They never, ever threw his money back in his face. He found himself looking forward to their nightly battles, to the spark of defiance in her eyes. Slowly, reluctantly, he began to talk. Not about his business, but about the crushing expectations, the loneliness of his position, the ghost of a father who had valued power over his own son. He offered her small, fractured pieces of himself, hoping she might see the man behind the monster. The atmosphere in the penthouse began to shift. The hostility that had defined their initial interactions slowly bled away, leaving a fragile electric tension in its place. It was in the small moments. Hannah was trying to reach a book on a high shelf in his vast, unused library, and he came up behind her, his chest brushing her back as he easily retrieved it for her. For a split second, they were frozen, surrounded by the scent of old paper and the sudden, overwhelming awareness of each other. Her breath caught in her throat. His hand lingered near hers as he gave her the book. Another evening, they stood side by side at the enormous window, watching a thunderstorm roll over the city. The lights of Seoul flickered below, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. "I used to be afraid of storms," Hannah said quietly, her reflection a pale ghost in the glass. "My father told me it was just the sky rearranging its furniture." Ji-hoon looked at her, at the soft curve of her profile illuminated by a distant flash of lightning. "My father told me it was a display of power," he replied, his voice low, a reminder that even the sky can be violent. The simple exchange revealed the vast chasm between their worlds, yet in that shared moment of vulnerability, the chasm seemed to shrink. She was starting to see past the intimidating chairman, to the lonely man who spoke of his father with a chilling lack of affection. He was starting to see her not as a fascinating project or an object to be protected, but as an anchor in the sterile emptiness of his life. She was real. In a world built on artifice and intimidation, her authenticity was the most precious commodity he had ever encountered. But the world outside the penthouse continued to turn. Min-jun arrived one afternoon, his face grimmer than usual. He and Ji-hoon spoke in low, urgent tones in the study. Hannah, passing by the partially open door, couldn't help but overhear. "Choi is making his move," Min-jun said. "He's consolidating the smaller factions, challenging our hold on the distribution networks. He's getting bold. Choi is a dog barking at a door he's too afraid to scratch," Ji-hoon dismissed, but Hannah heard the underlying current of stress in his voice. "This time feels different," Min-jun insisted. "He knows you're distracted." His gaze flickered for a fraction of a second towards the hallway where Hannah stood, unseen. The conversation raised the stakes. The vague, shadowy nature of Ji-hoon's business was beginning to take on a more concrete, threatening shape. Ji-hoon became more tense in the following days, the lines around his eyes deepening. He was more possessive of her than ever, his calls to check on her during the day more frequent, his relief upon returning to find her safe more palpable. He came home late one night. Hana was in the kitchen, making tea. She couldn't sleep. She heard him enter, the heavy sound of the door closing. When he walked into the light of the kitchen, she saw it. A dark, ugly cut across the back of his hand, fresh and bleeding sluggishly. Her heart stopped. "What happened?" she whispered, rushing forward. He tried to pull his hand away, to hide it. "It's nothing." "That is not nothing," she insisted, taking his hand gently. Her touch was hesitant but firm. She led him to the sink and began to clean the wound, her movements deft and practiced. He watched her, his expression unreadable. The sight of his blood, the undeniable evidence of violence, shattered the fragile peace they had built. The monster was not just a metaphor. He knew, in that moment, that he couldn't hide it anymore. The lies, the omissions, the carefully constructed cage of safety, it was all about to break. If he was ever to have a chance with her, a real chance, she had to know. All of it. After she finished bandaging his hand, her touch lingering on his skin, he led her to the living room. He didn't turn on the lights. They sat on the sofa, the city lights painting patterns on the floor around them. "Hana," he began, his voice raw, stripped of all its usual authority. "You asked me who I am. I've never given you a true answer." He took a deep breath, and then he told her. He told her about his father, a brilliant, ruthless man who built the Unsung Group from nothing, using legitimate business as a shield for a vast criminal enterprise. He spoke of loan sharking, of intimidation, of the violent enforcement that kept their empire intact. He explained that when his father died, the entire dark legacy had fallen to him. He wasn't just a chairman. He was the head of one of the city's most powerful crime syndicates. He was a gangster, a kingpin. He laid his entire ugly world at her feet, piece by sordid piece. He spared her no detail, painting a portrait of himself that was drenched in darkness. He confessed it all, the cold weight of his sins filling the space between them. When he was finished, a heavy silence descended. "This is who I am, Hana," he said, his voice barely a whisper in the dark. "This is the world you've stepped into. Now you know." He didn't dare look at her. He waited for the revulsion, the fear, the judgment. He waited for her to run. Hana felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. The vague suspicions she'd harbored were a pale, childish fantasy compared to this brutal reality. Kidnapping, violence, a criminal empire. It was the stuff of movies, not her life. Not the life of the man whose hand she had just bandaged with such care. She looked at him, a silhouette against the glittering skyline. She saw the powerful chairman, the terrifying kingpin, but she also saw the lonely man who had spoken of his father with such pain, the man whose eyes held a desperate, hidden vulnerability. Her heart was at war with her head. Everything she was, everything she believed in, her simple principles of honesty and hard work, screamed that this was wrong, unforgivable. But her heart, her foolish, traitorous heart, ached for him. It ached for the boy who had been raised in a world of violence, for the man who was trapped in a life he never chose. She had started to fall in love with Kwon Ji-hoon, but could she love this man? Could she live in his world, a world paid for by the suffering of others? The answer was a cold, hard stone in her stomach. No. She was quiet for 2 days. A chasm of silence had opened between them, wider and more terrifying than the physical distance at the dinner table. Ji-hoon gave her space, moving through the penthouse like a ghost. He felt her pulling away, and the agony of it was a physical pain, a constant, dull ache behind his ribs. He had shown her the monster, and just as he'd expected, she was recoiling from it. He had gambled everything on a truth she could never accept, and he had lost. On the third morning, she was waiting for him when he emerged from his bedroom, dressed for work. She was holding a small bag, packed with the few things she'd brought with her to the penthouse. Her face was pale but resolved. The defiance was back in her eyes, but this time it was tinged with a profound sadness. "I can't stay here," she said, her voice steady, though it cost her everything to keep it from breaking. "I can't be a part of this world, Ji-hoon." Each word was a hammer blow to his heart. He had prepared for this, but the reality was infinitely worse. He wanted to argue. He wanted to lock the doors, to command her to stay, to fall back on the only methods he knew. But he looked at her, at the principled strength that had drawn him to her in the first place, and he knew he couldn't. To force her to stay would be to destroy the very thing he loved about her. This was her choice, the first real choice he had ever given her, and it was destroying him. "I understand," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He didn't try to touch her. He didn't try to persuade her. He just gave a sharp, defeated nod. His love for her, it turned out, was greater than his need to possess her. It was the most painful realization of his life. He made a call. "Min-jun, prepare the car and arrange for a new apartment for her. By the sea. Quiet, anonymous. Transfer the funds." He hung up and looked back at her, his face a mask of iron control, betraying none of the devastation raging within. "You will be safe. All of your family's financial obligations have been handled. Permanently." Tears welled in her eyes, tears of gratitude and heartbreak. It was a final, desperate act of love, a golden chain he was trying to drape around her, even as she left. "Ji-hoon, I can't—" "You can!" He cut her off, his voice rough. "It is done. Just be safe, Hana. That's all I ask." Min-jun arrived, his expression carefully neutral, though he could not hide the sympathy in his eyes as he looked from his boss's shattered composure to Hana's tear-streaked face. The ride down in the elevator was silent. As she stepped out of his life and into the waiting car, Hana looked back one last time. Ji-hoon was still standing there, a solitary, powerful figure in his glass tower, watching her go, and for the first time he looked truly, utterly alone. Hana's new life was a postcard. She lived in a small, clean apartment in a sleepy coastal town where the loudest sound was the cry of gulls and the rhythmic shushing of the waves. She was safe. She was free. Her mother was secure, her future unburdened by debt. She should have been happy. She should have been relieved. She was miserable. The quiet she had once craved was now a deafening roar. The peace was a vast, crushing emptiness. She would walk along the beach for hours, the cold sea spray on her face, and find herself searching the horizon for the silhouette of a skyscraper. Every tall, dark-haired stranger she saw on the street made her heart leap with a foolish, painful hope. She missed him. It was a constant, physical ache. She missed his intensity, his infuriating arrogance, the surprising gentleness in his hands. She missed the feeling of being the sole focus of his formidable attention. She had run away on principle, but her principles felt like cold, hollow companions in her lonely bed. She had chosen her pristine moral world, and in doing so, she had ripped out her own heart. She was in love with a monster, and she was beginning to suspect that life without him was no life at all. Ji-hoon, meanwhile, descended into his own private hell. He did not crumble. He froze. He became a colder, more brutal version of himself. He threw himself into his work with a terrifying efficiency, his heart encased in ice. He moved against his rival, Choi, not with the strategic patience he usually employed, but with a swift, merciless aggression that stunned the city's underworld. He dismantled Choi's operations, crushed his network, and financially ruined him within a matter of weeks. There was no satisfaction in the victory. There was nothing. The penthouse was a mausoleum. The scent of her, a faint trace of freesia and soap, had long since faded, but he imagined it everywhere. He would stand at the window where they had watched the storm, his hand resting on the cold glass, and feel nothing but the gaping void she had left behind. Min-jun watched his boss with growing alarm. Ji-hoon was a ghost haunting the opulent halls of his own life, a king ruling over an empire of ashes. "Sir," Min-jun finally dared to say one evening, finding Ji-hoon staring blankly at a television screen that wasn't even on. "This is not sustainable. You are destroying yourself." Ji-hoon didn't even look at him. "Leave me," he said, his voice flat and dead. "No, sir," Min-jun said, his own voice firm. It was perhaps the first time he had ever directly disobeyed an order. "The empire your father built. You've always hated it. You've hated the violence, the filth, but you run it because you feel you have no choice. Is that power worth this? This emptiness?" Min-jun's words struck a chord deep within Ji-hoon's frozen core. He looked around the sterile penthouse, at the priceless art he didn't see, the luxurious furniture he didn't feel. He thought of his father's legacy, a poisoned inheritance that had cost him the only thing he had ever truly wanted. All this power, all this wealth, and it couldn't buy him a single moment of the peace he'd felt just watching Hana sleep. He looked at his bandaged hand, the cut now healing into a faint scar. He thought of her hands on his, her touch so careful. He had shown her the monster, but what if he could kill it? An idea, radical and dangerous, began to form. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't change who his father was. But he could burn the old world down and build a new one from the ashes. For her. He had let her go because he loved her. Now he would become a man she could come back to. The next day, Kwon Ji-hoon convened an emergency meeting of his top lieutenants, the true pillars of his shadowy empire. They gathered in the same obsidian boardroom, but the man who stood before them was not the same one who had walked out weeks before. The cold emptiness in his eyes had been replaced by a burning, resolute fire. "The Yoon-sung group is changing," he announced, his voice ringing with an authority no one dared to question. "Effective immediately, we are divesting from all operations that are not strictly legal." A stunned silence fell over the room. Men who had built their careers on extortion, illegal lending, and violent enforcement stared at him as if he had lost his mind. "We will be dissolving the private lending branches," Ji-hoon continued, his gaze sweeping over them. "We will be selling our interests in the nightlife establishments that serve as fronts. We are cutting all ties with the gray market distribution networks. Our future is in technology, in green construction, in global logistics, and in entertainment. We will be a legitimate corporation, a clean one." An older lieutenant, a man named Bae, who had been his father's right hand, finally spoke, his voice a low growl. "Chairman, with respect, that is our foundation. To remove it would be suicide. It would create a power vacuum. Our enemies—" "I will deal with our enemies," Ji-hoon cut him off, his voice like steel. "This is not a negotiation. It is a command. You will oversee the transition of your divisions. Those whose operations cannot be made legitimate will be given generous severance packages and retired. Anyone who resists this change will be removed." The threat was clear. The removal would not be gentle. It was a declaration of civil war within his own organization. The purge was swift and brutal, but not in the way his father would have managed it. Ji-hoon didn't use assassins and thugs. He used lawyers and accountants. He leveraged contracts, initiated hostile buyouts of his own lieutenants' front companies, and used his immense political influence to bring regulatory scrutiny down on those who wouldn't comply. He was dismantling his father's legacy with the very tools of the legitimate world he now sought to fully inhabit. He was burning his kingdom down, not with fire and blood, but with ink and law. It was a grand, terrifying gesture, a painful metamorphosis. He was shedding his old skin, and he was doing it for a woman who might never even know. The chaos of Ji-hoon's corporate war was the perfect cover for his enemies. Choi, who had been financially ruined but not entirely broken, saw Ji-hoon's going soft as a moment of weakness, an opportunity for revenge. If Ji-hoon's strength had been his ruthlessness, his new weakness was obvious. It was Hana. finding her was easy enough for a man with Choi's remaining connections. He snatched her from her quiet seaside town, a brutal intrusion of her past into her peaceful present. He dragged her back to Seoul, to a derelict warehouse on the industrial outskirts of the city, believing he held the ultimate bargaining chip. He believed he was holding Ji-hoon's queen. He didn't understand he was holding his entire world. The call came to Ji-hoon's private line. "I have her," Choi's voice gloated. "Stop what you're doing. Restore my territory, or she pays the price." A cold, primal fury, unlike anything he had ever known, washed over Ji-hoon. But beneath it, his new mind, the one forged in the fires of his transformation, was already working. He kept Choi on the line, his voice a low, dangerous calm. "Where are you?" While he spoke, Min-jun, standing beside him, was already tracing the call, dispatching teams and making another, more important call. This brought them to the warehouse, to the standoff. Ji-hoon stood in the doorway, the embodiment of cold rage. Choi held Hana, a gun to her head, drunk on his perceived power. "I think it has everything to do with her now," Choi sneered, cocking the hammer. But just as he spoke, the rolling metal doors of the warehouse slammed down, plunging the room into near darkness. Powerful floodlights from outside pierced through the grimy windows, and the sound of sirens wailed, growing closer with astonishing speed. Red and blue lights flashed, creating a chaotic, disorienting strobing effect. "What is this?" Choi yelled, his confidence shattering. Ji-hoon took a step forward. "This is the new way of doing business, Choi," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "No more back alleys, no more honor among thieves, just the law." As he spoke, a heavily armed police tactical unit burst through a side door, shouting commands. Choi, bewildered and trapped, froze for a fatal second. It was all they needed. He was tackled, disarmed, and subdued in a flurry of professional motion. His men, equally stunned, surrendered without a fight. It was a clean, legal, and devastatingly effective victory. Ji-hoon had not come alone. He had brought the full weight of the legitimate world with him. While the police secured the scene, Ji-hoon rushed to Hana. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the ropes on her wrists. The moment she was free, she launched herself into his arms, burying her face in his chest, her body shaking with sobs of terror and relief. He held her, his arms wrapped around her like steel bands, his face buried in her hair. He breathed in her scent, the scent of home, and his carefully constructed composure finally broke. "Hana," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She pulled back just enough to look at him. She saw the change in his eyes. The haunted emptiness was gone, replaced by a desperate, hopeful love. She saw the man he was becoming. "I'm changing," he said, his voice raw with unshed tears. "I'm tearing it all down, the old world, all of it, for you. I am." Tears streamed down her own face. She knew he was telling the truth. She had felt it in the way this terrifying ordeal had ended, not with more violence, but with order, with law. He had changed his entire world for her. "I know," she whispered, and with all the love and longing that had tormented her for months, she reached up, pulled his face down to hers, and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a desperate, passionate, claiming kiss, a fusion of two worlds, the end of their separation and the first moment of their future. It was the taste of redemption. 6 months later, the scent of fresh paint and blooming roses hung in the air. Hana stood in the garden of their new home, a beautiful, light-filled house just outside the city, far from the cold glass tower that had once been her prison. The penthouse had been sold. This house, which she had helped design, was a home. Warm, inviting, and real. She had found her calling, working as an art consultant for a new charitable foundation, established by the Unsung Group, a foundation dedicated to supporting emerging local artists. She was using her innate sense of beauty to build something good, something that came from the ashes of Ji-hoon's old world. The Yunsung Group was still a powerhouse, but its reputation was in the midst of a sea change. The corporate war had been costly, but Ji-hoon had won. He was now known as a ruthless but brilliant reformer, a titan of legitimate industry. The whispers of his family's past still lingered in the shadows, but they grew fainter with each new hospital wing he funded, each park he built. She heard a car pull into the drive and smiled. Ji-hoon stepped out, and the man who walked toward her was not the same one she had first met. The severe lines of tension around his eyes had softened. He still wore his expensive suits, but he had shed the invisible armor of a lonely king. He looked at her, and his eyes, once so full of shadows, were now filled only with light. With her. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder as they looked out at the garden she had so carefully planted. "Everything is quiet," he murmured into her ear. She leaned back against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "It's a good quiet," she replied. He was still intense. He was still possessive of her, but it was no longer the desperate grip of a man afraid of losing his only prize. It was the deep, secure hold of a man who had found his anchor, his partner, his redemption. He had changed his world to be worthy of her, and she had found the strength to trust in a love that had once seemed impossible. Here, in their garden, surrounded by a peace they had built together, they were finally, simply home. This story teaches us that true strength isn't found in controlling the world around us, but in having the courage to change ourselves for the better. Love, in its most powerful form, doesn't just accept us as we are. It inspires us to become the best version of ourselves, even if it means tearing down an entire empire to build a new foundation based on trust and hope. We really hope you enjoyed this educational piece of content and hope that you could understand the moral lessons behind it. It's a reminder that no one is beyond redemption and that the bravest act is often choosing a different, more difficult path for the sake of love. If you are moved by Ji-hoon and Hana's journey, please show your support by hitting the like button, subscribing to our channel for more dramatic stories, and sharing this video with someone who believes in the power of second chances. Now we have a question for you. Do you think Hana was right to leave Ji-hoon even though she loved him? Was her painful decision necessary for him to truly change? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And finally, we want to know what you want to see next. Which story should we tell? A. The story of Min-jun, the loyal second-in-command, as he finds an unexpected love of his own while navigating the new Yunsung Group. B. A prequel story about Ji-hoon's ruthless father and the dark origins of his criminal empire. Vote for A or B in the comments section, and we'll bring the most popular choice to life. Thank you for watching.